Hey friends, Steve Guttenberg here. This is the Audiophiliac Daily Show. Today, this is a big one because it's another vintage review. I did the first one last week with the Macintosh C22. That was a 2 preamp. This week it's the Phase Linear 4000. Knobs and switches, absolutely. Lots of controls, lots of buttons, lots of features, but I've got to give you some background about how this came to be. Phase Linear was started by a legend in the audio business, Bob Carver. Now, Bob Carver, in 1969, he designed a 700-watt amplifier that he put into a coffee can or something, right? And in those days, amplifiers were not that powerful. And the fact that he created this monster amp got everybody's attention. He started the company in 1970. And I think the first commercial product was the Phase Linear 700, which was a 350 watt per channel stereo amplifier. It was a monster. Rock bands bought it, recording studios used them, PA systems in clubs. Everybody was buying these amps. They craved that power, and finally they had this monster amp. Now, the thing was, no one was saying it was a great sounding amp, I don't think, but it was about the power. Forget finesse, forget high-end audio. This is pre-high-end audio, really. So it was about power, and everybody talked about it. It was a big deal. And of course, I wanted one, but I couldn't afford it. It was like $700 or something, way out of my price range. This one, though, the Phase Linear 4000, comes along in 1973. Now, think about that. 1973, what was happening in the 70s in audio? Quadraphonic, 4-channel surround. Now the thing is, so this is a quad preamplifier. It's a 4-channel preamplifier. It's not a stereo preamplifier. Now the thing is, I can tell you, having lived through this period, that I didn't give a crap about quad. It was a non-event even when it was at its peak. And in 1973, when this preamp came out, it was at its peak. And here we are, 47 years later, and I still don't care about surround sound for music. So even though it is a quadraphonic 4-channel preamplifier, I never had the urge right now to try it in surround because I don't have any music to play on it that's in quad. My bad. If that's what you're waiting for this review, let's get that out of the way right up front. Now that little joystick right in the center, that's how you position yourself front to back, was with that joystick, and left to right even, which is, again, it's in the cool factor sweepstakes. The Phase Linear 4000 is a very strong contender because it's got tons of really cool things about it. Now it's interesting, you open up the owner's manual, which I found the PDF of, and what does it talk about right away? It doesn't talk about quadraphonic. It talks about, sit down, get ready, the loudness wars, although it wasn't called the loudness wars then. It was talking about dynamic range compression. It's 1973. It's the all analog world. And they were obsessed about dynamic range compression in vinyl, right? It's squished to be on a vinyl record. So a lot of what's going on in this preamp is to unsquish it, to open up the dynamics. Well, I tried that part of it, and I can't say I was terribly impressed. But there's so much more to cover before I talk about those specific aspects of its design. What does it sound like? I'm just going to paint with broad strokes here. It doesn't sound like a modern preamp, that is for sure. It has... it's very solid state, not surprisingly. It's kind of, despite the whole thing about dynamics, it's kind of constricted, uptight sounding. Listening to this preamp, you're traveling back in time. You're listening to Led Zeppelin, or still hanging on to the Beatles in 1973. You're listening to that music, and you just feel that sound. It doesn't feel like a modern preamp. It's not transparent. It's not open. Doesn't have great low-level resolution. It doesn't sound modern. But it doesn't sound bad. It does sound, well, it does sound gritty. There's a grit to the sound. It is noisy. It's not as noisy as the Macintosh C22 I reviewed last week, but it isn't exactly quiet. But it's got this grainy quality to the sound. I wouldn't call it hiss, like a grainy hiss. A sandy coloration, I'll put it that way. But anyway, it's easy to ignore. It wasn't a problem. And I was really enjoying myself listening to this preamplifier. Then there's the Auto Correlator, which is a 4-band dynamic noise reduction circuit. All analog. Mind you, remember it's still the 70s, which is kind of amazing. Now, it was there to suppress rumble in turntables, hiss from tape, in a dynamic system. It wasn't just a static, solid, set a level noise filter. It was dynamic. Very impressive for the time. Does it work? Well, when I played records, I can't say I was all that impressed with what it did, but it was doing something. I can't say it was better than not using it. You can take it in and out of the circuit, but it's there. If you have nothing better to do one day when you're playing records, you too can, if you buy this 4000, you can try it out. But I wouldn't lose any sleep if you never got to hear it, because it's just one of those things like, really? But anyway, it's cool that it's there. Instead of calling the loudness filter a loudness filter, Bob Carver decided to call it active EQ. It was a 50 hertz, 6 dB per octave boost. So, and that works, definitely. I like loudness controls, and this loudness control worked very, very well. Carver definitely had a knack for naming the features on these things that he designed. And there's the Peak Unlimiter downward expander, again, about expanding the dynamic range of vinyl and even tapes. That one sort of works, actually, and I was playing this Kraftwerk album, Tour de France, and the thing about with electronic music, it did open up spatially when I did that. It's a great recording, and the Peak Unlimiter downward expander, I don't know about dynamically, but spatially, it definitely opened up. It was a cool effect. But then when I tried the same feature with acoustic music, it just sounded kind of weird. It just kind of added this extra level of grit. There's grit. There's a lot of grit in the sound of this preamp. It's not that hard to ignore, but as a reviewer, I'm supposed to be listening for these things, and I was kind of off-putting. But on the Kraftwerk record, it was actually really cool. The bass and treble controls are not your ordinary bass and treble controls. They're adjustable. The bass can either control 40 hertz or 150 hertz. The treble can either handle 2K or 8K as their center position, basically. And they're cool. They work, but yeah, I like them, actually. I did use them, and I found them useful, which is not always the case with bass and treble controls. So the Phase Linear 4000 comes to me, is on loan to me from Fernando at Sky-Fi Audio in New Jersey. He sells a lot of vintage gear, great stuff, really cool, interesting things like the 4000. Last week he reviewed the Macintosh C22, was on loan from Sky-Fi. And next week, coming up, the final part of this 3-part series, an Audio Research SP3A1 tube preamp. But the 4000 is the center of attention today, and I gotta say, it put me through some changes. By the way, it's 19 inches wide, it's like rack mount width, but it's only 9 inches deep, so it's actually pretty shallow. And the construction of the chassis itself, by high-end contemporary standards, seems kind of flimsy. Like you tap on the top cover and it just kind of rings like a bell. It's very thin metal. It's not very impressive heft-wise. But you're not usually touching the back of it. You're usually touching the front. And by the way, of course, there's no remote control. Remote controls were not a thing in the 70s. But the controls, the knobs, the switches, the buttons, they felt great. Really, really nice. You're interacting with the piece as you use it, since it doesn't have a remote control, and how these controls feel is a big deal. Certainly was at the time. I remember watching people when I was a hi-fi salesman years after this period, and when I would see my customers always touching, preamps and power amps. They're running their hands over the chassis and turning the switches and turning the knobs. They wanted to feel that sense of quality. Whether it was real or not, that's another matter. But in terms of what it feels like in your hand was definitely a very big deal in the pre-remote control days. Like I say, I'm not going to go into detail about the sound of this preamp because honestly, I don't think, it's not like the Audio Research or the Macintosh that has this huge, juicy, enveloping, wrap your arms around you, hugging you sound. No, it's not that kind of thing at all. It's solid state, it's early solid state, it's not terribly refined. You have to be in the right mood, and to fully appreciate the phase linear 4000 sound, you should pair it to some sort of nicely, gently rolled off sounding speakers to get rid of some of that grit, and just take it for what it is. It's a curio. It's a curiosity of its time. It's got a great story, great history behind it. Bob Carver went on to start Carver and Sunfire after this. He's doing some interesting speakers now. He's still around. He's still making great stuff. But this is where it all began, at least for preamps with him. So there you have it. My name is Steve Guttenberg. This is the Audiophiliac Daily Show. Thank you so much for being here. If you're a subscriber, thank you for subscribing. If you haven't yet subscribed, what are you waiting for? Please do. And by the way, when you do, you got to hit that little notification bell and so hit that button right down there. Hit the notification bell so you'll be notified every time there's an amazing new episode, just like this one, maybe even better if that's possible. Beyond that, you should check out the Patreon, which can be found at patreon.com/audiophiliac. Can't write that down fast enough, I got you covered. There's a link directly below in the description. And by the way, there you'll also find a link to Sky-Fi and this particular preamp and a bunch of other cool stuff that they have at Sky-Fi. What else can I tell you? Well, I got playlists. I got playlists for speaker reviews and headphone reviews and music reviews. Lots of cool stuff, including interviews with Fernando. I'll link to that from Sky-Fi. Now I am done. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you back here again very, very soon.